Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in our reviewed and ranked series. Today we are tackling an incredibly awesome character and one that I've been looking forward to talking about for a long time. And that, of course, is the King of Kinetic Energy, Gambit. This character is awesome on so many levels, and his kit really backs that up. He's a very stylistic character, and I think that he has one of the best designs in the entire game. Before we jump in and talk a little bit about how Gambit works, make sure you check to see if you are subscribed to the channel. If you're not, go ahead and fix that for me real quick, because the subscription is free and easy and there's daily variety content coming your way. And if you find today's video helpful, interesting, and or enjoyable, make sure that you hit that like button. Let's go ahead and start where we always do, with the team build synergies. Gambit has 4 of these team build synergies, and it's nowhere near the most impressive in terms of array that we've seen, but the synergies that he has are very practical in their scope. He has 2 strength synergies, one with X-Men and one with martial artists. He has a mastery synergy with agile fighters and a vitality synergy with smooth operators. And there's a lot of potential out of the strength and mastery synergies, and who doesn't love having a little bit of extra survivability when going into a fight with your opponents. So all things considered, the synergies are really nice to have around with this character. Moving over and talking a little bit about the base functions of the character, Gambit has the longest standard attack sequence, without question. With only 4 inputs, you hit that button rhythmically 4 different times. By my count, you get 9 different hits on his combo. His first input gets 2 strikes, his second input gets 2 strikes, his third input only gets 1 strike with a staff bash down on the ground as opposed to the blows out in front of him. And then that 4th input has 2 or 3 connecting hits as he twirls the staff around before ending with a final bash with that staff. So 8 or 9 hits either way. That is more hits in a basic attack sequence than any other character that we've seen. Maybe if you include, I think it was Deadpool, who shoots out a flurry of blasts from his submachine gun, but those are fairly negligible hits in his combo, so I certainly don't count them as each individual shot. But Gambit, on the other hand, those are all solid connecting hits in his standard attack sequence. And bonus points for making physical contact with your opponent, which, at least from the grunt type enemies, discourages retaliation out of the middle of your combo. Gambit's heavy attack is a very interesting attack, as well as it is an arc of explosive energy that emanates out from his staff and in a direct line in front of the character in the area that he releases that. There are 5 different concussive blasts that happen all in a series out along the character, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that attribute of his kit is important when we talk about his abilities, or one of his abilities in particular. But a really nice ranged capability out of the heavy attack here, and I like the multiple series of blasts there as well. Gambit does have a mid-air double jump in the form of a somersault, like every other double jump character does in this game, and there's always benefits to having some increased maneuverability when traversing different hazards throughout the battlefield. So, not the craziest thing that we've seen, but certainly something to help him out as well. Gambit's falling aerial attack is a scepter blast where he will strike the area down in front of him with his staff, and that will create a concussive blast in a circular area from the staff specifically. It doesn't emanate from where Gambit is, but it's a fairly potent blast and has some benefit with other attributes of his kit as well. So certainly an option that is decent. However, there's not an ability that Gambit possesses that would cause him to use his falling aerial in a natural setting. So there's not a whole lot of scenarios where I recommend this, though contrary to most other characters that I've mentioned that about, there is one specific utility for this falling aerial, which we will mention in just a few moments. And finally, on the aesthetic side of things, Gambit's block and dodge animation, we do have a block using that staff or incorporating that in front of him in kind of a diagonal brace out in front of him to mitigate incoming damage from his opponents, which it's always cool to see unique animations in terms of it defending against oncoming attacks. And then to avoid those attacks and moving out of the way, he does perform that combat role that I am oh so fond of. So let's pivot and talk a little bit about Gambit's abilities. And it was a little bit of a rough call to determine a move that has DLC privilege within Gambit's kit, though I did make a final decision, and unfortunately it's not this first ability, but there's still a lot of power behind it. Gambit's first ability is Luck of the Draw, where he will send out a couple of explosive cards. He will send out 3 specifically per use of this ability that will embed themselves in the ground, and those can later be detonated by explosive attacks or abilities. So you can use other abilities of his, you can also use that heavy attack or the falling aerial to get that detonation to take place. And other explosive attacks will detonate these as well, so it does not have to be you that sets them off, but it is more beneficial if you're able to make use of those detonations. You can have up to 4 sets of these cards for a total of 12 embedded in the playing field at any point in time, and if they are close enough to each other, then you will be able to chain the explosions off of each other. You see that I, in the demo reel here, am applying the ability 5 separate times, but you will also notice that the first set of cards that I throw out fades as I throw out that 5th set, giving us the total of the 4 sets or 12 total cards. And then there's massive explosion damage, especially if you are able to stack those up on top of each other. Now, the real reason that this ability doesn't get the DLC Privilege Award is it's very niche and it takes some time to set up, but you can get a staggering amount of damage out of this if you are able to detonate these cards around opponents, particularly those grunts. If you can get them to group up, this can be a really good option for clearing the battlefield. This ability has the energy attack type and the explosive synergy trait, has Cs across the board in terms of damage, stagger damage, and energy point consumption. And as most of Gambit's abilities are ranked up, they will benefit from a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage, an increase to the stagger damage dealt, and finally that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. There's only one ability that falls outside of that, and we'll talk about it in just a few minutes. Gambit's second ability is the Kinetic Burst, which is very straightforward. It's similar, if not identical, to every other burst type trait ability that we have seen up to this point, with the unique animation of that burst emanating from Gambit's staff, impacting into the ground, and having that 360-degree burst of energy emanating from around him. And since this does have that explosive energy, this is an ability that is capable of detonating the Luck of the Draw cards if they are within range of that blast. Nothing super flashy, but it is a decent get-off-me tool if you found yourself surrounded by a lot of those grunt enemies at any given point in time. This ability has the energy attack type and the burst synergy trait. Again, has Cs across the board for the damage, stagger damage, and energy points consumed. Now here's a really deceptive ability for you, the Deadly Deal. This is a very fast flurry of attacks, more specifically in the realm of some of these cards that he will repeatedly throw out. I don't know where he gets all of these cards, because you're going through multiple decks by the time that you are using this ability if you are mashing the button repeatedly, which you can do as long as you have available energy points. And this ability puts basically every other rapid fire and even though it's not technically a barrage type attack, it puts those barrage type attacks to shame as well in terms of the sheer amount of hits that it has, as well as the explosive damage that is dealt by those cards upon contacting an opponent. And you can pivot one way and the other for about 150 degrees of motion collectively, from straightforward to right and left as you're using this ability, and that's pretty good in terms of coverage. And if it weren't for some of the lackluster details of the damage that this ability is able to deal, this would have been the DLC privilege move, and it was honestly a really close call for this one. This one takes a narrow second place. The Deadly Deal has the energy attack type and the rapid fire synergy trait, and has a C classification to damage dealt, which again is pretty good, especially because this attack has a really quick turnover and you can kind of spam it, so this stat is a little bit negligible, all things considered. It has a C for the energy points consumed and an E classification to the stagger damage dealt. Gambit's fourth and final ability is the Dangerous Ground, and this attack may not look like much, but there's a lot of good that comes from this ability, and if you haven't figured it out yet, this is the one that has the DLC privilege classification within Gambit's kit. And let me explain to you why. Sure, it looks fairly lackluster. There's a field of energy that deals continuous damage to your opponents. It lasts for about 14.5 seconds, and it also causes any enemies within that radius to be slowed, and that leaves them vulnerable to follow-ups from your own toolkit as well as the rest of your team. So that already bolsters the application of this ability quite substantially. The other thing that bolsters this move's practicality and why it ultimately makes it into the DLC privilege slot is you can have two of these fields active at any given time on the field. And we'll talk about Phoenix in 2 weeks when we get around to breaking down her kit, but you can then combo one of her abilities into this to take up more space on the battlefield and get additional benefits out of that. You can eat up a lot of space on the battlefield with just Gambit, and if you do combo with Phoenix, you can really make sure that you are dealing constant damage to your opponents. This works really well in closed arena type fights against massive groups of enemies, but really there's no reason for you to not have this ability active more often than not. And we talked a little bit about a similar performing ability with Miles Morales' Electro Web, but this ability stays active a lot longer and provides better benefits than the Electro Web does. So hats off to this ability for being just an absolute beast and being capable of having multiple instances active at any given time. This ability cannot be synergized. That is the one drawback from it, but you really wouldn't need or want it to be anyway because it does enough on its own. It does have the energy attack type, has a B classification to damage dealt, making it Gambit's best damage dealing ability, in addition to being a continuous damage dealing ability. Has a C classification to energy points consumed, and it does have an F classification to stagger damage dealt. It will still chip away at the stagger gauge. However, the biggest benefit of this ability is the fact that the opponents are slowed and rendered more vulnerable to follow-up attacks and damage rather than being staggered out. As this ability is ranked up, it has fairly similar benefits with that reduced energy point cost and the increase to the attack damage dealt, but instead of having increased damage dealt to the stagger gauge, it has an increase in the duration of the move, which is far better in terms of application for this ability. And then finally, it does have that standard reduction to the attack being interrupted. Gambit's extreme ability is pretty good for what it is. It's a very quick attack, taking just under 5 seconds to fully culminate. It basically rolls a couple of animations with a couple of twists together from Gambit's abilities. You first have that Luck of the Draw type ability where he will throw out a series of cards in a ring or a circle, He will then set up a larger dangerous ground type field, which doesn't linger, unfortunately. That would really push this ability into the realm of being absolutely ludicrous in terms of how it behaves. And then finally, there is a larger Kinetic Burst that will cause the entire area of effect to blast into one massive blast. So a lot of really good things that happen here, and if you do have any luck of the draw cards active within the area of the extreme attack, it will cause them to detonate on that final blast as well. The biggest thing that you need to keep in mind with Gambit in using this ability is he doesn't really course correct, but he will take a decent stride forward when he initiates this attack, so you can close in a little bit on your opponents, but it's generally in the area that he's facing, though I think there's some instances where he has turned and moved a little bit closer to the bigger bulk of opponents. But given the fact that it's a 360-degree effect type attack, you're bound to catch up a decent amount of those opponents, and it's much more powerful in the terms of a crowd control type extreme attack rather than direct damage to boss characters. So now that we've looked at everything that Gambit has to offer, it is time for us to determine where he belongs on our character tier list. And I've been singing praises about him all video long, so it should come as no surprise that I am highly in favor of him being on the top portion of this tier list. He very clearly outclasses characters in B tier and below, and I would even say that he outclasses the members of A tier. Yes, he doesn't have those elemental type effects that I really like from the likes of Thor, but with the sheer amount of damage that he's able to crank out, as well as rendering the opponents with increased vulnerability while dealing constant damage to the rest of the team, there is a lot of good things going for this character. So I do think that for the first time in several videos, Gambit is a worthy candidate to place up here in the S tier of characters. That being said, I do not think that he outclasses Black Panther. I don't think that he quite has what it takes, especially due to recent developments in the speedrun meta that are calling where I have Black Panther currently ranked into question. He may belong even a tier or two higher within S tier, but if I fully decide on reevaluating that, I will be making a video breaking down what I think the top characters in the game are and what the reasoning behind that is. So a little bit of a sneak peek for a video that you can expect to see before the end of the year. But I do feel like that's a solid placement for Gambit. We'll leave him at the bottom portion of S tier, based again very heavily on the fact that he is incredibly capable of dealing mass amounts of damage to large groups of enemies at any given point in time. But what do you think? Do you think that I have overranked Gambit? Do you think that there's things that I haven't taken into consideration? Or is there anything that I'm missing about his kit? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. Again, if you've made it this far into the video and you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe for that daily variety content. Thanks again for your time, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.